with my picture. This image often comes to my mind when I'm thinking about our country, Zimbabwe, and the ways in which we've individually tried to find solutions. To me, Zimbabwe is a big ship, and Zimbabweans are carpenters, each of them carving out the ship to make little boats to save themselves whilst the ship is sinking. It always seems to me that we work so hard to foreground the things that divide us, and don't work as hard to foreground those things that unite us. So today I'd like us to think of Zimbabwe, our sinking ship, and I hope the presenters that are coming forward to give us lessons from Africa will help us start thinking about ways in which we can stop carving out what's left of the ship and start trying to repair it. I mentioned yesterday in my summary that we seem to have a discourse where we are very fragmented, where the idea of charting a way forward is always confronted with all the things that divide us, whether it's class interest, whether it's gender, whether it's demographics, the idea that the youth have to be exceptionalized. So all of these things came to my mind. Thank you for the image. So this morning, okay. Oh, I'm done talking about the picture. Now I'm going to talk about our speaker. Thanks. So this morning, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Adebayo Olukoshi to come and address us. He will be giving us lessons from Africa, and his particular topic will be revisiting the relationship between democracy and inclusive development. What can Zimbabwe learn from Africa? So he'll address us for a good 45 minutes. And while he's making his way up here, I'll give you his profile very briefly. Professor Adebayo is Director for Africa and West Asia at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. He has more than 35 years of experience in the area of international relations, governance, and human rights, both in the academic sector and intergovernmental institutions. Professor Adebayo was a member of the African Union Assessment Panel and chair of the board for several think tanks, including European Center for Development Policy Management and Open Society Initiative for West Africa. He has also previously served as director of the UN African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, as executive director of the Africa Governance Institute, as executive secretary of the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa, and as director of research at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, a senior research fellow, research program coordinator of the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, and senior program staff at the South Center in Geneva. So I hope you will give him your undivided attention. I look forward to the question and answer session, our plenary session, as we deliberate on how Zimbabwe can take lessons from the rest of Africa. Thank you very much. You may applaud.
Thank you very much indeed, moderator, and thank you for your generosity. First and foremost, good morning, colleagues. And let me say how very delighted I am to both witness this event, which I think Sipo summarized very well for all of us who have been somewhat associated with the birth of CVO in one form or the other, when he intervened yesterday to celebrate both the occasion as well as the initiative. And I'll just simply say to you, Tendai, bon courage, and more grease to your elbow as you build this noble initiative. I think also the discussions yesterday were in many ways a kind of homecoming for me, reconnecting to a lot of the debates going on in Zimbabwe. Is it a second republic or is it not a second republic? Do we have a junta or do we simply have a transition in motion? Transition to where? A range of issues which Sabelo raised in his address yesterday around the coloniality and some of the old debates that involved scholars in a community in which I think several of us here are associated, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, where I was also privileged, where I cut my teeth as a scholar, actually, and also had the distinct honor and privilege to serve as executive secretary for a period of 8 years. And as I reflected on the topic you gave me, Tendai, first reaction was that it's a very big topic. How does one discipline the subject in the context of the contemporary reflections going on in Zimbabwe? And Chair, you didn't make it easier by referring to that boat analogy and thinking that there might be lessons for the rest of, for Zimbabwe from the rest of Africa, when in fact one could actually argue that that boat can also represent the African continent, which is sinking. And we are all, in a certain sense, involved in a beggar thy neighbor policy of wanting to save ourselves, despite all of the proclamations of Pan-Africanism. But perhaps the best way to go ahead and tackle this subject is to take the form of a narrative over time. And that narrative I would want to situate, first of all, at a conceptual level, in terms of three broad discussions that have dominated the debate on the relationship between democracy and development. The first, of course, is the classic chicken and egg situation. Which comes first? Does one develop first and go for democracy, or does one democratize and then hope that development will follow? It's an old debate. It did not start in Africa, but it became an issue that was posed on our table right at the beginning of the independence process on the continent. If we take 1960 as the putative year of the African independence, and reflecting back to the anti-colonial struggles, in which, of course, the struggle itself, if you recall, was defined as a democratic struggle by nature and by definition. But at the heart of it, of which was a concern to restore dignity, win freedom, and achieve progress, which basically was distilled down to development. But soon after independence, these issues, which seemed quite straightforward at the beginning of the anti-colonial struggle, became perhaps more complicated in the politics of post-independence development. And the big issue was essentially whether Africa was itself ready for democracy. Was the multi-party system the appropriate method by which Africa was to democratize? Was it not divisive in the context of the legacy which colonialism left? The colonialists may have given the impression that they surrendered the territories to the nationalist politicians who fought for independence. But in fact, there was quite a rich literature and that documented the divide and rule approach which the colonialists employed. First to establish their domination and then to resist the independence struggle until finally they gave up and looked for other methods of continuing to exercise influence, which Nkrumah and others described as the neo-colonial moment. But the argument at independence was that we inherited a legacy of divided societies. Sabelo's reference yesterday to the twin task of state and nation building. And the assumption which was made by the nationalist coalition that came to power was that in order to begin to move us away from the legacy of colonialism, it was important at the first level to build strong state institutions. And more than that, the assumption also that on the basis of a strong state institution, we would be able to proceed to address the legacy of divided societies, and that the unity project could only be constituted from above by that same state. Okay? I want to make a distinction between the building of state institutions and the assumption that underpinned that whole project at independence, that only the state was capable of constituting the basis for unity, on the basis of which we would then begin to see other dividends of independence. And over time, this was to really basically come down to a very crude division between two perspectives. Those who believed that for the time being, in the context of the project of state and nation building, what we inherited as multi-party systems in electoral democracy was in fact a distraction, and that it was important to rally everybody in society behind a single project of society, right? Rally all the groups in society behind a single vision. And it wasn't really, I would argue, and I do so with a bit of, I'm cautious in doing so, but I would argue that it wasn't actually always opportunistic when that debate took place, and those who took the position that actually this Western model of democratization that we inherited, because it came to be characterized as such, is not terribly helpful to us, because it actually tends to reinforce the divisions in society which colonialism had deliberately created. And you know, if you read the likes of Terence Ranger and the whole group of historians in Southern Africa who worked around the notion of the invention of tribalism in Southern Africa, you will see this actually played out in different forms across the continent, in which colonialism basically stereotyped different groups. And independence was achieved on the basis of some of those stereotypes, in which it was assumed, for example, if I were to use Nigeria, that if you are a Hausa person, you are a good administrator. If you are a Yoruba person, you are a good accountant. You're good with figures. If you are an Igbo, you're a good trader. And a division of labor occurred on that basis, in which power was to be handed over to one group who dominated the security forces and all of the institutions of state, as it were. And other groups were simply to fall in place. This was divisive in every sense of it. And that stereotyping played itself out in different shapes and forms across the continent. Now, those like Mwalimu Nyerere, and even to some extent Kwame Nkrumah, who argued that this actually was a distraction, and that it was important to have a project of society on the basis of which all of society will be rallied in order to achieve that leap forward that Africa needed, to play a catch-up game with the rest of the world, having been retarded by the colonial experience built upon the experience of slave trade, basically became an important element of the political and intellectual debate of the first decade of independence. And I say that it wasn't purely opportunistic, because I think for all of the disagreement that many of us would have with somebody like Mwalimu Nyerere, the last thing we would at least say is that he was driven by Idi Amin type corruption and abuse of power and office. He wasn't, of course, the most benign of leaders. He took tough positions and tough decisions. But think through about the Ujamaa Declaration and the ambition that underpinned it. The whole idea that society could be reconfigured in such a way that rather than the kind of atomized and dispersed populations that seemed to characterize Tanzania at independence, it was possible to begin to aggregate population in a way that would enable for social services and other gains of development to be brought to the citizenry, and to make independence from that point of view meaningful. So what seemed for many academics like an abstract discussion on whether it should be democracy first or development first actually became a concrete issue of choice that confronted many. And for those of them who pushed the line that it was important to mobilize the population around a shared project of development, it was easy to begin to make the transition away from multi-party politics on the basis of which most of the countries of the continent attained independence, and to introduce the single-party idea and practice that came to dominate our continent in the period from the early 1960s to the end of the 1980s. But every good idea also does have its own corrupting effects. The concentration of power, the idea that the state needed to be built, and that only the state could constitute the project of unity, translated into political practice, actually became the core of the origins of post-colonial authoritarianism. One nation, one destiny, under one God, with one leader who eventually began to interpret his role and himself as a life president, never to be challenged, no vacancy in the State House. Joseph Kizerbo was in fact who, I think for those of you who are familiar with him as an intellectual, was part of the anti-colonial struggle, was one of those who refused to go into government at independence, actually as a Pan-Africanist, left his native Burkina Faso, Upper Volta as it was known, to join Sékou Touré in the resistance against the French, met the Nkrumahs and Nyereres, and traversed the continent in a committed focus on the liberation of Africa from colonial rule. Joseph Kizerbo, reflecting on his life a few years before his death, gave a speech in which he said, you know, these things did not seem at the time to be problematic because intense debates took place. How are we going to move this continent forward? Colonialism did lasting damage of a kind which we needed to reverse. Mentally, we needed to liberate people. The decoloniality discussion that is going on today, we needed to liberate people. Don't forget, an entire elite was brought up on the basis of a principle of assimilation. And assimilation meant that in order to be modern and to be accepted, you had to repudiate yourself and everything in your being. The whole idea, only the skin, the color of your skin did not change. You actually even hated the environment in which you operated, and you saw yourself more like a French person. And hello, that might sound familiar when you find a president, a product of that assimilation experience, who actually governs his country from Geneva. Right? Live. It's not an invention. Sits in Geneva and governs the country. And Kizerbo said, you know, for them who are the radical nationalists, they felt that perhaps if they paid attention to the issues of re-education in the context of a central focus on advancing development within the framework of a single-party system, it might be quicker to accelerate the transformation of the continent for the better. 30 years later, 40 years later, he said, he suddenly realized actually that going back to visit his friends with whom he was involved in all kinds of struggles, signposts at the door of the State House, silence, development in progress. And yet, it was a monopoly of power that had come to be imposed on much of the continent And the contestation of that monopoly was to produce a series of contradictions that became the stuff of politics in Africa in the period between 1960 and 1980. In the first instance, those who claimed the monopoly on power as the father of the nation, usually all men, father of the nation, actually themselves held on to power only because they cultivated a very narrow ethnic base. From claiming to impose a single-party regime in order to unite the country, many of those who became the beneficiaries of the transition from a multi-party order to a single-party regime became themselves the biggest champions of ethnicity of a very narrow and parochial type. And the disaffection which this created within the broader polity was to begin to produce contradictions such as those that led to the onset of the coup d'etat across the African continent, beginning from the small Republic of Togo, where those in the hinterland of the country felt that as an oligarchy in the coastal area of the country had taken and confiscated power and leading a military rebellion, actively supported also by external forces. We saw a chain of developments that effectively meant that much of our continent became either a single-party state or a military oligarchy. And it no longer mattered. The argument that development was the priority began to ring hollow in many years for many citizens. The whole notion of the social bargain between state and society, why would I give my loyalty to a state, was itself gradually eroded. Yes, there was economic growth for the first decade of independence, thanks really largely to the Korean boom, when the Korean War took place between the North and the South, and the effect of that on commodity prices that effectively translated into enhanced revenue receipts for many of the countries of the continent. But in reality, for the generality of the population, the notion of the bargain between state and society began to be eroded. Now, of course, Zimbabwe was still in the throes of liberation struggle through most of this period until 1980. The nationalist politicians were themselves part of the conversations taking place in the rest of the continent. But at independence, you will remember that it wasn't really much longer that the debates began to be had in this country, whether in fact Zimbabwe should be heading towards a one-party regime or not. Right? If you remember the discussions of the 1980s into the 1990s before the constitutional reforms that effectively rejected the single-party order, and cast your minds back to the arguments which were put forward, and you would see a transmission of the arguments that took place in the 1960s in much of the rest of the continent, effectively refracted into the debates which took place here in Zimbabwe as to whether democracy or development, single party or multi-party. But when we look at it closely, it might actually have been a false debate altogether. And in a certain sense, Amartya Sen, in his notion of democracy, development as freedom, resolved it theoretically by saying that the very notion of development, if it does not enhance choice for the citizenry, and therefore empower them in a way that they are able to exercise and enjoy freedom, ceases to be meaningful. And the symbiotic relationship between democracy and development, of the idea that you can actually democratize and simultaneously, in doing so, promote development and transformation in society, began to gain currency in the course of the 1980s and 1990s. And yet for Africa, for the rest of Africa, and Zimbabwe was to join that train later. By the end of the 1970s, with cumulative crisis and loss of confidence in the leadership of most of the countries of the continent, a succession of coup d'etats, regions like West Africa and Central Africa, hardly a few months passed that you didn't hear martial music and a new group of people announcing themselves as the new redeemers of the nation, preparing to correct all of the wrongs of yesterday. And in fact, by the end of the 1970s, the populace had gone completely weary. And matters were not helped by the fact that the external debt crisis, which faced most of the countries of the continent as commodity prices fell and loans that had been taken were being called in by various creditors, effectively set Africa on its most severe post-independence crisis, economic crisis, that ever was recorded, with a massive collapse in incomes, of a massive devaluation of currencies, of an invention of new language of economic administration, which is very familiar when I listen to the conversations from yesterday. Do we have a currency devaluation or not? Do we have a new currency or do we not have a new currency? Structural adjustment became the game in town for most of the countries of the continent. And with structural adjustment, effectively, what was imposed by the international financial institutions was a framework which basically argued that Africa needed to get the prices right. By getting the prices right, I said the language itself was designed to be benign, right? And the marketing was also designed in such a way that for the unsuspecting public, it was difficult to understand that we were being wrong-footed and cornered into a dead end in the development experience that was to last for at least 25 years. Basically, what the IMF and the World Bank argued was that African countries were living beyond their means, and that it was important to begin to correct the situation by getting prices right. Politically, they appealed to the agricultural community, that rural majority that had been long neglected by independence and which was penalized in order to favor an urban minority of elites, which for many of us on the left was quite appealing. For many people on the left, this sounded like music. At all, rural majority, the working poor, neglected, and examples which the World Bank and the IMF gave of subsidies that basically went for the benefit of the rich, subsidizing their lifestyles, importing luxury goods when the masses cannot afford basic consumer goods. The World Bank became a populist institution from that point of view. But in fact, behind the idea of getting prices right was the whole notion of what today Amartya Sen, Paul Krugman, and others describe as austerity. And austerity was simply the imposition of belt-tightening measures on a people who were already really down and out in every sense of it. Again, some of this conversation I think will be familiar for those of you who followed the march of Zimbabwe in the 1990s into ESAP. It was called the Economic Structural Adjustment Program in this country. For most of the rest of the continent, it was called simply Structural Adjustment Programs. A lot of that conversation was also of a populist type, marketed in such a way as to give the impression that corrective measures were being taken that would be to the benefit of the bulk of the population, if only people would be patient to reap the dividends. The issue of the relationship between democracy and development, in a certain sense, came back into the equation. Get the prices right, said the World Bank, and everything else will be added onto you. It wasn't infrastructure at that point in time. It was get the prices right and everything else will be added onto you. And if you want to read the manifesto of the entire philosophy of neoliberalism as it was constructed and applied in Africa, which became the giant experimental field for all of the ideas of the neoliberals, both political and economic. Go back to Robert Bates, Markets in Tropical Africa, and then read Elliot Berg, the so-called Berg Report, about what needed to be done with Africa. Cut down the state to size was part of the slogan. Remember, at independence, the idea was that we needed to build the state in order both to unite the country and to achieve developmental transformation. The World Bank said, no, mistake. 20 wasted years, actually, of independence, from the 60s to the 80s. We need to cut back the state, roll it back, cut it down to size. Whatever would market the policy effectively at that point in time, they talked about downsizing. When Rabu Rausas, like some of the people in this room, said, no, you can't downsize, they said, okay, right-size it. Choose your language. Yeah, we shall right-size the state. And in that process, introduced a raft of unilinear liberalization measures, of which I think we're all very familiar. Liberalization of interest rates, which effectively meant that in most of the countries of the continent, interest rates for any loan taken from a bank to do any business was in the region of 40% and above. And it's difficult to understand what business you would do. But they said, no, it would discipline people because people were busy borrowing money to drink champagne in Lagos. It was cheap to go to the bank, get a loan, and buy champagne from France, when in fact farmers couldn't get inputs, right? Liberalize exchange rates. They didn't say devaluation, they said liberalize exchange rates so that money will go after what is really needed instead of frivolous expenditures. Liberalize trade so that you can export and import in a context in which much of what we produced were really raw materials. And effectively, a process of deindustrialization was set in motion. But the World Bank argued that that fiscal discipline that it was imposing through structural adjustment and all of the associated reforms would have the benefit of producing a new middle class that will be disciplined in the ways of the market and which will become the bearer of the new democracy in Africa. That was the essential logic of the neoliberal model. And around it, a whole new political economy school was developed. So for a few years, I think the likes of Yao, who believed themselves to be political economists, suddenly found World Bank officials popping into their offices and saying, I'm from the World Bank, I'm a political economist. I work on the new political economy approach, which essentially was the politics that was built around the framework of structural adjustment. Get the prices right, and you might in fact get a proper democracy that will be the end result. And to the extent to which you are not making that transition between liberal market reforms and a liberal democratic order, it was only because you were not implementing the policies correctly. And so the solution was to give you more structural adjustment. For every failing that was registered, you were told to go back to the drawing board and tighten your belt a bit more. What began, for example, as a simple privatization, commercialization, and sometimes liquidation of public enterprises was shifted into the civil service. Create incentives, new managerial approaches. That's the missing link. And for every 2 years, for those of us who followed the literature and the debate and the policies at the time, for every 2 years, you found actually that new slogans were introduced by the World Bank and new approaches were developed, essentially not so much to advance economic development or even the goals of democracy, as was claimed, but to reallocate resources in favor of a new middle class and of international finance in a way which effectively reduced much of Africa to the testing ground for some of the kinds of policies that have attracted the backlash that we are seeing in Europe and other parts of the world today. Now, the contradiction and the irony in all of this is, of course, that by the end of the 1980s, as we were structurally adjusting, citizens were also in tightening their belts, saying there has to be change. We can't go on this way. And it started in a small country of West Africa, Cotonou, then a republic led by a Marxist, so-called revolutionary, Matthew Kerekou, former military officer who proclaimed himself the leader of the Beninois Revolution and who effectively held the country with an iron grip for almost 2 decades that he was in power on the basis of a daily dosage of ideological menu on the radio and television, where he gave speeches, marathon speeches that basically mimicked what he thought was happening in China and in Moscow. Long speeches to exhort the people to revolutionary arms, and in the midst of it, people saying, but we are hungry. The baseline is that we are hungry, and this cannot go on. And the demonstrations that led to the Sovereign National Conference and the so-called third wave that began across the continent came side by side with this notion of structural adjustment. Naomi Kazan, who did her studies in Ghana, came up with a book which basically said, finally, as civil society began to awaken, and the World Bank, for the first time, began to invest in creating civil society, in inventing civil society of the type that will become the bearer of the message of structural adjustment. Civil society that is disciplined in the ways of the neoliberal economic reform that will be anti-state by definition, because this was essentially the anchor of structural adjustment, an anti-state ideology which would be replicated by civil society. And, you know, many people unwittingly, there are many reasons to be angry against Idi Amin and to assume that, you know, the Ugandan state has been reduced to rubbish. And somebody tells you, you need to cut the state down to size. You say, yeah, no, I agree. But your political agendas were completely different. And the World Bank realized it. And in investing in its own civil society, with the scholars like Naomi Kazan, who constituted the new high priests of the political economy approach, arguing that finally society is winning against the state. And yet one would wonder, how does society make sense if there is no state? If the state has been so right-sized to a point where by the end of the 1980s, by the admission of the World Bank itself, Africa had become the least or the most under-governed region of the world. The most under-governed region of the world. Symbols of the state, like the post office, that little post office that existed in rural areas, disappeared. The national commercial banks, where private banks would not venture, that had little outlets in the most remote villages across the continent, disappeared. And the only face of the state which citizens saw was the coercive state. The police was always there. If the police were not there, then a chiefly authority that exercised some policing power was there. But in terms of the broad representation of political community, the state had been withdrawn decimated, and yet the argument that society was winning began to dominate the discussions of the late 1980s into the 1990s. Now, the movement that began in Benin and which mushroomed across the rest of Francophone Africa, parts of Lusophone Africa, which led to the collapse of single-party regimes, eventually to the end of military rule, was rightly celebrated as an important victory in the restoration of some form of participatory democracy for the bulk of the populace. In reality, however, there was a certain choicelessness that was built into it. And if you look at the thesis which Lisa Laxo produced on the experience of ESAP and democratization in Zimbabwe, for example, she repeats this notion of the choicelessness that confronted citizens. There seemed to be plenty of motion, and there seemed to be plenty of momentum in society. There seemed to be plenty of action and activity. And yet, at the same time, according to Lisa Laxo, citizens were voting without choosing. They were called to the polls to have a phalanx of political actors presented to them in the name of democratization. And yet, at the same time, there was really no choice to be exercised. In a slightly different context, Tandika Mkandawire was to describe this as the emergence of Africa by the end of the 1990s into a new era of what he called choiceless democracies. Democracies in which, regardless of who, as citizens, you thought you were voting into power, it didn't really matter. If you removed Mr. X and put Arthur Mutambara in his place, they are going to implement the same policies. It doesn't matter what Arthur Mutambara's manifesto was when you decided that actually I will put my votes for him. Because the moment he gets into office, he is confronted by a host of realities that effectively will turn him into the biggest champion of the structural adjustment framework. And hence the choicelessness that we could never really distinguish. And political scientists began to celebrate an alternation of power. That certain ruling parties lost power, new ones came in, Kereku was voted out, Soglo came in, Soglo lost, and then Kereku came back, and then Yayi Boni, and we celebrate this as, this is democracy in action. But in reality, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it appeared to change, the more it actually remained the same. And for the World Bank and the IMF, this was a perfect combination, because they essentially argued that where authoritarian regimes in the 1980s had failed to be faithful to the structural adjustment framework, elected government could claim the legitimacy to enforce austerity. And therefore, for them, electoral engineering became an important component of the new political economy approach. How do you save structural adjustment was the name of the game, not how do you advance the frontiers of democracy. And in order to save structural adjustment, it was good business to appear to democratize. And so the World Bank started actually telling its client regimes, actually you should do elections. We have money for you to actually even do elections. Elections, elections, elections. And at the end of the day, the real content of policy that could address issues of development on our continent were completely sidestepped. And it seemed like throughout the period to the end of the 1990s, all thinking about economic policy direction and the content of policy and the mix of policy was determined for Africa from Washington. No exception. None whatsoever. If it came to poverty reduction strategy papers, we all implemented them at the same time. One country will start it, By the following year, when finance ministers come back from the spring meeting, others can pretend to call it something else, but at the end of the day, the content was the same. The World Bank asked countries, this is the new game. You need to do poverty strategy reduction papers. You need to introduce all kinds of measures designed to save the framework of structural adjustments, but not much more else. And to do it with the legitimate cover of an electoral process, which was itself bereft of any meaningful choice for the generality of the people. And I think this is essentially the game which we have played. It's the game which we have played to date, in which effectively democracy has been reduced to multi-partyism and electioneering, periodic electioneering. It doesn't matter whether the quality of elections is as good as citizens would want to see it. In fact, in a lot of cases, we see that electoral integrity has been on the decline massively across the continent. Alternation of power takes place, but citizens do not see the change which they desire or which they deserve. And effectively, we have found ourselves in a situation in which this continent has easily become the home to the poorest cluster of people anywhere on earth. As we claim to democratize, as we claim to also have a new Africa rising on the back of commodity prices, we see new levels of poverty and new levels of inequality, which effectively disempower citizens, that make it possible for people to pack 5 kg bags of rice and put the face of a politician on it and distribute it on election day in order to win an election and to claim that they have a mandate. Of people who have been effectively driven into so much penury and poverty in too many of our countries, that violence that is also associated with the political process has almost become a mainstream part of our so-called experience of democracy. And I want to suggest that the Zimbabwean story, in a certain sense, may have come a decade or more later than much of the rest of the continent. But it was in fact the same story that we were dealing with. And effectively, we found a situation in which a tiny elite, having found a mechanism, a modus vivendi, to coexist within a neoliberal framework, effectively has held on to power, but abandoned every notion of a vision of society. Whatever is presented simply for the purposes of appearance. And I think many of us feel it. I often sit at AU meetings and people look at the people on the podium, the heads of state, and say, well, there's no inspirational figure. And I interpret that simply to mean that there's nobody with any vision for anything anymore in many of our countries. Effectively, politics has been taken out of politics, and a new politics of anti-politics has effectively been enthroned in so-called democracies. A new politics of anti-politics in which ideas of what we understood to be politics as a game for transformation has been replaced by a new meal ticket approach, or what a governor in Nigeria called stomach infrastructure. How he won his election, they asked him, what was the secret? He didn't say my manifesto was superior. He said, if you don't get it, it was stomach infrastructure. And I simply, on election day, gave people money and food and told them how to vote. And when you come out and you show evidence that you voted how you were instructed, you receive the balance of your money. Usually pittance, 5,000 naira. 5,000 naira in today's exchange rate is $15 US dollars. They give you 2,000 before you go in, you collect 3,000 when you come out. But you have to take a photo of the ballot paper to show that you thumb-printed the right place and show me that you actually thumb-printed the right place. Say the stomach infrastructure. That's how we won. So there's absolutely no project of society that informs much of what we are talking about. And it seems to me that we are once again back to the drawing board in terms of our search for how to find the kind of politics that will deliver the kind of development that we desire and deserve. Now, that discussion at the dawn of the new millennium led to some conversation about the developmental state. And you would remember that a few countries actually started auto-proclaiming themselves as developmental states. Not so much because of what they were doing, but because it sounded good to be called developmental state, right? From Kenya to Ethiopia to from Botswana, basically saying now we are a developmental, we are in the developmental state phase of our transformation. And in a certain sense, this was really reflective of the crisis of neoliberalism, the global crisis of neoliberalism, which challenged the precepts, the foundations of that doctrine and the damage which it was doing to society, not just in Africa, but also other parts of the world, even if we were the biggest experimental field, of the kinds of developments which we saw in Europe, of people basically challenging their governments, challenging the EU, of budget targets and deficits that must not exceed 3%. All of those came together to bring back the idea of development to the table, but not refracted in our context in a way that has demanded of us the kind of thinking of what type of development do we wish to see for our societies, on the basis of what vision of society around which we can then construct politics. And this is my own understanding of the kind of symbiosis we need to build. Under the neoliberal approach, politics, culture, and society were to be disciplined to the dictates of a model of economic development, which we call neoliberal. It was assumed by the neoliberals that they know the answer to economic transformation and that they have the model, and that the only problem that is left is how to discipline society to the dictates of the model. And if you think that this is an exaggeration, read Larry Summers, chief economist of the World Bank, writing in one of the publications of the bank in the 1990s, when he said, we know how to grow the economy. Economists have solved that problem. What it takes, the policy mixes to grow the economy. What we don't know yet, and which we need to find an answer for, is how to fix politics to the needs of growth. Just translate that. And then you begin to understand the contradiction between the idea that neoliberalism might deliver liberal democracy and reconcile it with the claim of the chief economist of the Africa division of the World Bank at the time, in the 1980s, an Indian, who basically, in a moment of honesty, was pushed and asked, do you think that this will really, can an elected government deliver this kind of thing? He said, yeah, well, no, let's be frank. You need an effective and ruthless government to be able to implement some of the things which you are prescribing, even if in the long term, that government will then have to accommodate a new middle class, give it voice, and therefore representative democracy will come into place. But effectively, that hasn't happened. None of the promises of structural adjustment was delivered in any meaningful way, whether at the political, at the economic, and at the social level. And essentially, what I call for is not so much a disciplining of politics to economics, but the inverse, of disciplining economics to a vision of society. If we do not have a vision of society for ourselves, we are not going to be able to design the kinds of economic policies which we require in order to transform ourselves. And for much of the movement which we have seen around the idea of the developmental state, of all of the SDGs and the Millennium Development Goals and all of the ideas that have been introduced and to which our countries have, as always, subscribed without asking too many questions, at the end of the day, if you do not have a vision for yourself of where you want to go, a notion of what kind of society you want to build, then you cannot begin to design economic policy of any meaningful way, of any meaningful type, that will help both to transform society and simultaneously democratize the political process. And it seems to me that this is the biggest challenge which we are all confronted with. New governments come and they think that their duty is simply to call elections as quickly as possible, right? Hence the idea of the Second Republic. Elections take place, they don't change anything. People are promised all kinds of possibilities, hopes are raised, expectations explode, that, yeah, the demon of yesterday has gone. The problem is that the structural conditions that produce the demon of yesterday will produce a new demon for tomorrow if we do not change the paradigm and the framework of politics. Getting politics right, it seems to me, is the biggest challenge. The World Bank argued that we should get prices right. I want to suggest, and I think I echo in this regard, some of the ideas which were raised yesterday, that until we get the framework of politics and governance right, neither state nor society will be constructed for a meaningful purpose, let alone a developmental one. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, that presentation was very loaded. So what I'm going to do at this point is we're just going to open this to the floor so that we take some questions and comments or reactions to that. I'll start with the first. Oh, Jan, okay, that's fine. Jana is there. Yes, the comrade is there. I'll take 4 in this round. Can we get the mics?
I have one. I have one already.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Delta, and thank you, Prof, for that prolific and articulation of the story of Zimbabwe. I felt put to shame that you seem to have read so much about my country, referring to a lot that I haven't read, so I'm challenged. So I've got 2 questions for you, especially to take advantage of your view of the Africa continent. And my 2 questions are, 1, what are the lessons we are not learning as Africa? And I think even as us, the people in this room who are people who are not necessarily in places of state power and the role that we could play and should play. And then the second question is, one of my issues is that in this continent we lack role modeling. We know the things that need to be done, all of us, but many times we've not really seen it. Where have you seen the kind of leadership that articulates a vision and has the will to actually implement that vision within this continent so that we can latch onto that to frame some of the narratives we want to push for Zimbabwe? Thank you.
Oh, okay. Comrade Kwisai, and then Dr. Morisa, and then I think is that Philip next to Otto? I'm not sure. But Comrade Kwisai is next.
Thanks, Adebayo. I just got the tail end, but it was so loaded I can't resist coming in, even if I got the tail. But I want to link what you have given with, I've got here our manual for a training program we do for young trade unionist workers in Zimbabwe, to learn from the experience of Zimbabwe and how to move forward in terms of the rich history of Zimbabwe. And 3 of the documents that we use in our manual is 1, a seminal speech by Thabo Mbeki, the philosopher president, The example you give, you can remove X, put Arthur in, but they are constrained by the structures of where they are. And Mbeki is a very good example of that, because he implemented a neoliberal regime, but comes from a radical Pan-Africanist philosophical background. So he gave a seminar lecture in immediately after the July 2013 elections in Zimbabwe, at UNISA, at the Mbeki African thing. And his concern was Zimbabwe and the role of African intellectuals vis-a-vis Zimbabwe. You have said that Zimbabwe came 10 years later, but is essentially the same. In some ways, I want to partially disagree and say that there may also be very important lessons from Zimbabwe. The concern from Mbeki in his lecture was what he called a disproportionate attention on Zimbabwe by global forces. He argued that I think there is so much attention globally to a country on the continent which is actually in itself, never mind the diamonds, is not that particularly important. But it is important because it is setting in the minds of some a bad example which must be defeated. And he says, as African intellectuals, are we doing our job? My sense is that we are not doing it. We are not explaining what is this enormous interest in a small African country here in Southern Africa, which really basically, I can't think of any particular reason, why it could have such enormous global geostrategic importance, but it has. Why? So that was the thesis of his lecture. And Mbeki then goes on to say his answer then is that Zimbabwe set a bad example. He spoke to a Zimbabwean intellectual just before the elections who argued that the MDC was going to sweep the rural areas. Mbeki said, I don't know which country he's living in. He then says, the consequence is that I've looked at least 4 books that have been written about the land reform in Zimbabwe, all of which in fact say, the process of land reform in Zimbabwe has given land to at least 304,000 new land owners. The peasants of Zimbabwe at last own the land. The program succeeded and has this direct benefit on these huge numbers of Zimbabweans. And so I found it very strange that this intellectual friend of mine could say the MDC would win the elections in the rural areas. They couldn't essentially because they were identified by that rural population to have opposed land reform, rightly or wrong. So Mbeki's then conclusion is that the African intellectuals have to defend what he calls the Zimbabwean example, because it's ultimately not about Zimbabwe, but it is what we have talked about. The reversal of neo-colonial relations of production in terms of property relations in land. That is one effect of the Zimbabwean nationalist revolution. And related to, so I would want to hear your example, your discussion on possible similar comparisons, if any, in West Africa. And then secondly, related to the Zimbabwean example, is that the anti-structural adjustment programs produced one of the most systematic class fightbacks by the working class across the continent, produced one of the most powerful political movements centered on the working class, built the MDC, Morgan Tsvangirai, who have sustained, but to what extent? Again, I want to hear your examples, if any, from West Africa, of whether or not we've had a similar kind of movement. But the tragedy of the MDC, then eventually being co-opted by the kind of civic society forces, ideological forces of neoliberalism to the right, up to the extent today that it is the MDC which produces the mantra that Mnangagwa runs with. The mantra of Zimbabwe is open for business was the one that was in the 2013 MDC manifesto, which has now been adopted by ZANU-PF. So I'm also interested in that class dimension. Thank you. Sorry for the too much time.
Okay, I understand that the Prof's presentation was very loaded. So there are so many ways to unpack and so many ways to interpret what he has to say. Now I'm getting that the questions are equally loaded. So I'm going to ask, can we take one more, or do you want to handle these 2? One more, Dr. Morisa.
Oh, Bio can handle 10. No. Yeah. No, mine is very short. Prof, the narrative, and it's a very important narrative, was it normally lacks, especially in Zimbabwe, the international and how it affects the Africa, global north, global south, etc. But what I found, and because we sort of use that argument, but the pushback is always to say, when are you going to be considering the internal contradictions? When are we going to be, because it looks like we're absolving the political elite across Africa when we are laying the blame squarely on what is coming out of the Bretton Woods institutions. When are we going to be interrogating our own political elites? And somebody says, surely 40 years, Zimbabwe is turning 40 next year, surely 50, 60 years is enough time for us to come to a place of maturity that we can actually begin to problematize our own lack of leadership or lack of institutional development. Yes, there's the external question, but how about the internal question?
Okay, that was very succinct. Thank you, Dr. Morisa. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the feedback. Jana, your question is also a very large one. What lessons are we not learning? You know, there are many lessons which we don't seem to learn on our continent. One, for me, is still the notion and the idea that the best solutions to our challenges actually have to come from outside the continent. It's one straightforward lesson. And so you see us flip-flopping. We are following the US model today, and now China is the new thing in town, and everybody wants to, you know, you're summoned to China for a summit, and you all go up there and believing that solutions will come from there rather than from inside. And I think that mentality, how to change it, the day we succeed in changing it, I think will be the beginning of our true liberation on the continent. I think that's why the work which Sabelo and others are doing on bringing back decoloniality into the agenda of scholars is so important. That mental state that assumes that the best advice that a president can get can only come from Washington or from London or from Paris. It's alive. As the chief economic advisor to the president of Senegal when I was there at the Planning Institute, thought he was onto something when the president invited him to leave his post in the university. A well-known statistician, I think Tendai was also in Dakar at the time, Mubarak Low is his name, to come and help with a blueprint for his first 6 years in office. He went in there, produced the document, did consultations across the country, and the president took the document to Paris. And in Paris, a group of kids in the finance ministry said, no, I mean, honestly, this is too ambitious for Senegal. You are too ambitious for yourselves. You know, you need to cut this down to size. And they produced a new document which the president came to proclaim as Senegal Emergent, Emerging Senegal. Right? And the guy immediately read this and said, I mean, this guy whom you relied on to produce this document is not going to be fit to be my tutorial assistant. And now he's the one determining policy for our country. I mean, you might as well just go ahead with him. Public resignation. It wasn't secret or anything. He called a press conference with the two documents. So is there an offense for us to be ambitious for ourselves? When you build monuments and towers and fast trains and everything, is that not ambition for France? What's wrong with Senegal being ambitious for itself? What's wrong with an African having ambition? But you cannot just imagine an African having audacious policies and taking bold steps and saying, you know, we must do infrastructure as a priority, open up new corridors and everything. I think it's here at the end of the day. And very few countries have been able to overcome that. You say, for example, which model has come close? What kind of leadership has come close? Our history is littered with attempts at that kind of audacious leadership. I think the real question is, why doesn't the system which we operate manage to sustain them for long enough? Because if you get the right kind of person, the forces that are arrayed against the person immediately are numerous. But what is the story of Nkrumah? What is the story of Lumumba? What is the story of Thomas Sankara? There are people who are very clear what they wanted for their societies, what they wanted for the continent. They were not prepared to, kowtow to anybody, external power. They were self-confident, self-assured, but somehow, in the equation of power, were able to find a situation in which they actually do lose out, and business continues as usual. And I think part of it might have to do with the nature of the politics of transformation, which tends perhaps a bit too excessively to be centered on personalities rather than on a broad-based movement. And the hero and crowd approach, which basically means that once you take out the hero, the crowd becomes effectively rudderless in terms of where to go. And narratives are so powerful. Narratives are so powerful that it's very easy. The easiest thing you can do is to construct a story and basically in 48 hours change our perception of Gwisai. It's a machinery that is available to do that. Right? And people will begin to say, oh, really? So, you mean this is what Gwisai was doing? They will begin by, first of all, showing what you ate for dinner in the State House. Right? Exaggerate it, make it look sumptuous, luxurious, and everything, and then leak a story about, look at the bed that he was sleeping on, whilst he was shouting the masses. His golden bed. And then our perceptions begin to change. You say, this Gwisai was a hypocrite. So essentially, this is what I would say in response to it. There are many things that we need to unlearn. And I think in connecting that to you, Tendai, I think part of the thing for me, internal contradictions are always there. They are not isolated. No internal contradiction in any part of our continent, or anywhere in the world for that matter, is not unconnected to contradictions externally. There is an interface, and they reinforce each other in a benign or in a negative way, one form or the other. But the biggest challenge of leadership is actually to unlearn many of the things which leadership assumes is the norm on our continent. Or how many of us would see that unlearning happen and feel comfortable? We begin to say, this guy is a bit maverick. The fact that you are unlearning received wisdom about how to govern your society, and questions begin to be asked. And let us not make any mistake. The power of transnational interests is not simply outside our boundaries. It is actually embedded in the fabric of our societies today. That you actually don't even need people to come from Washington anymore, in a lot of cases, to tell you some things. Because there are many people, Washingtonians, right in the fabric of your society. Yeah. Embedded, comfortable, powerful, networked, and who will fight you every inch of the way for some of the changes which we know are beneficial, but which they cannot countenance because it alters the power equation. I think this is essentially sense in which I think I was present at that lecture, by the way, where Thabo Mbeki was speaking. At one of the Timali, I was on the board of Timali, and it was the Africa Renaissance Conference, and the late Samoyo was there too. And he actually specifically cited Samoyo's book on the land reform at the time. Now, I think the context was more a bit of a foreign policy discussion when Thabo Mbeki made those observations. And my own response to it at the time was that, yeah, of course, we've come to a point on the continent where, in the first instance, compare the solidarity that accompanied Zimbabwe's independence struggle, and then look at the deafening silence that accompanied the land reform process. You already see two different worlds, right? As a student in Ahmadu Bello University, I knew all the nationalist leaders. I knew all the war commanders from Zanla and Zipra. We had their posters in our bedrooms. And we also wanted to be like them, like Joshi Tongagara. And people even had nicknames. Look out Masuku, a Hausa boy who just basically admired that fight for liberation. And the solidarity was continent-wide. Land issues that were at the height of that struggle, recall, 20 years after independence, not a single African country. Mbeki did whatever he could. He told us the story at that meeting. Tony Blair, it was public, so I can repeat it. Tony Blair coming to him and saying that what's going on there is unacceptable. And we are determined to remove Bob from office. And we want to send an advance team of commandos to use South Africa as a base to infiltrate. And how he as president said, no, over my dead body. Number one, not your business. Number two, if they land here, we shall arrest them and we will prosecute them. And number three, any breach of our territorial integrity will be resisted by the South Africa Defense Forces. That was all behind the scenes, right? But very few African countries had the courage, the kind of courage which we had in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, to say that liberation is our struggle. Most presidents, it didn't matter ideology, Guisai, for most of them. Leave out Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire. Even Senghor, in his UN speeches, would make reference to the settler colonies of Southern Africa and the liberation that had to take place, and of how people made contributions. And so something changed in our politics, right, on the continent. Our Pan-Africanism simply has degraded over time from that active, engaged commitment to a project which we all believed in, regardless. We have come to a point where the Pan-Africanism today is really, quite frankly, technocratic. We've taken the politics out of Pan-Africanism. And for most of our leaders and also most of the elites, Pan-Africanism is what you do when you gather at the AU to make speeches, talk about broader solidarity, sign agreements which you have no intention of implementing, and contradict those same agreements by going to sign bilateral ones with imperialist forces. So I'm not surprised at all. And I would say that the kinds of bold measures, you don't even have to be Marxist, leftist, socialist. You just need to be bold and audacious. Here is a vision of society. I want to lift 5 million Zimbabweans out of poverty by 2020. What do I need to do? I'm sorry, IMF, I disagree with your policy. You will suffer for it, but this is what we want to do. When you succeed in doing that, the same IMF will come back and celebrate you as a success story that other countries should emulate, and then write your story according to their own logic and sell it to others, right? It's how it works. The East Asians, they disobeyed everything that the IMF and the World Bank told them. The Chinese did the opposite. Whilst we were busy adjusting, they were busy pumping money into infrastructure, supporting entrepreneurship and the like. And when they succeed, now people come and want to give us lessons on the Chinese model and how it worked and what you need to learn as Africans from China. Not hearing it from the Chinese themselves, but from the World Bank and the IMF. So I don't know if I'm answering your question in a very clear way, but I think essentially many of our leadership are still mired in that idea that the solution comes from outside. I did a chapter in a book in honor of Thabo Mbeki, in which I addressed the issue of gear. How was it possible? And I interviewed him. Honestly, you guys, you came into office, we all were invited to meetings to discuss RDP. If you remember that document, RDP. And we thought the ANC was going to implement RDP. And the next thing, Mr. President, we started hearing about gear. And when you unpack it, it's essentially a shadow adjustment program. You didn't need adjustment. And his answer was simply that, you know, the moment Mandela was sworn in, go back and look at the figures and the trends. South Africa was hemorrhaging capital. Money was running out of South Africa on a scale that was not sustainable, and which would have meant the crash of the rand under our watch. He called the Reserve Bank governor to say, but Mr. Stiles at the time was still the inherited Reserve Bank governor. What do we do to stop this? Why? It's a question of confidence. People just don't have confidence. They like Madiba, and they hear the message of the Rainbow Nation. But first of all, go and warehouse that money in London, in New York, and elsewhere, Geneva. And what do we do? What's the solution? So you need to give them confidence. And gear was the product of that effort to try to give confidence, to stabilize, say, calm down. We are not about to nationalize. We are not about to do all of the bad things that communists are supposed to do. Mr. Mandela may be a good man, but we don't trust him. And then, of course, this Thabo Mbeki is deputy president, and, you know, and that was their calculation. That was the calculation of the markets. And he called the big business leaders, Anglo-American, all of them, Rio Tinto, to the union buildings to have a meeting with them to say, can we stop this? But until they signed that agreement and produced that document of gear, and you saw the consequence in terms of transformation, the pace of change in South Africa, right? It was basically slowed down. And so basically relations of power. And I think one of the things which we still miss on this continent, quite a lot, and for many of us on the left, we talk about organic intellectuals that are necessary. Who is the organic intellectual of Mnangagwa? Tell me the name of the Zimbabwean. Who is the organic intellectual of Buhari? Who is the organic intellectual of Macky Sall? Well, that of Macky Sall is a kid in the finance ministry of France. Right. And go back to 1960. Who were the key advisors of President Nyerere? For all the admiration we had from Nyerere, they came from where? The UK. His key economic advisors came from the UK. Sussex University, London School of Economics, Fabian socialists. And when the roof came caving in. They were also the first to start writing that Ujamaa was absolute rubbish. The same people who produced the technical paper for Ujamaa. I remember saying to one of them that this was the height of dishonesty. The very height of dishonesty. At the very minimum, you keep quiet. And if you want to be honorable, you defend that this was what we were thinking. It may not have worked out that way, but the ideas, the ideal, the hope was noble. The intention was noble. No, they were the first. They called conferences. I refused to go actually to one of them. How Ujamaa was authoritarian, Stalinist, collectivization, and all of that. But they wrote those papers. If we don't bridge that gap between policy and thought on our continent, I don't see how we're also going to go far. I don't, personally. To the extent, and that's why I made the point emphatically, that we basically subcontracted every thinking about economic policy to Washington. It doesn't matter. In opposition, we meet people in opposition, and people are saying, no, let's get in there first. When we get there, we are going to fix things. The moment people get in there, the first trip they take is to Washington. And when next they see you on the corridors, as they tend to see Yao Graham, they say, Yao, the last communist standing, my friend Yao. The last communist that is still standing. That is to say that the ship already left. You continue your sloganeering. Development is in progress.
Thank you so much, Prof. Okay, so we are absolutely behind time. No, please. We were delighted to be behind time. If only because that was a very, very, very fulfilling experience. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a 10-minute break for tea. If by 11:05 you're not done with your tea, please bring your cup in here so that we get the program going. So the teas are outside. 11:05, you and your teacups. If you feel you're going to need another cup of tea, bring both of them. It's fine. So that we don't